During the Great War, there'd been no dramatic increase in aircraft speed. The 90 miles per hour achieved by this BE-2A of 1914 rose only to 125 miles per hour as reached by the fighters of 1917 and 1918. Aircraft range, however, was vastly extended. When the Frenchman Louis Blériot flew across the 20 miles of English Channel in 1909, it was considered an amazing feat. Yet exactly 10 years later, two Englishmen, John Alcock and Arthur Whitten Brown, succeeded in crossing the Atlantic, crash landing on the Irish coast in their converted Vickers Vimy bomber. Between the two world wars, flying caught the imagination of the world. Pilots like the American Charles Lindbergh and the Englishwoman Amy Johnson trailblazed their way around the world. Airlines followed in their wake, dramatically speeding up communications around the globe and bringing its peoples closer together. Aircraft flew ever faster and ever higher. As for the military use of aircraft, the creation of embryo strategic bombing forces during 1914-18 cast a long shadow. The air theorists of the 1920s and 1930s believed that the bomber could win wars on its own by striking at the heart of an enemy nation. But the fighter still had an important role to play in gaining and maintaining air superiority over the ground battlefield. Up until the mid-1930s, the fighter looked little different to that of the Great War. Its wooden construction and twin planes meant a comparatively slow rate of climb, making it difficult to intercept bombers before they dropped their bombs. The coming of the metal-framed monoplane fighter changed this. Its significantly higher performance meant that it could catch the bombers in time. This was especially so now that newly introduced radar could now give much earlier warning of the bomber's approach than earlier methods based on sound. At the outbreak of war, the Germans had a first-class fighter in the Messerschmitt Me-109. It had already proved itself in Spain during the Civil War, and the 109 Emil, which entered service in 1939, was capable of speeds of over 350 miles per hour. The German fighter pilots had also developed a highly effective combat formation, the Finger 4, much more flexible than the RAF's Vic formation. The Germans also had the twin-engined Me-110, whose role was as a bomber escort. This too flew at more than 350 miles per hour, but lacked the maneuverability of the 109. During the Blitzkrieg years of 1939-41, the Luftwaffe tried to gain immediate air supremacy by destroying opposing air forces on the ground. While it was never wholly successful in this, its fighters outmatched their often obsolete opponents, and so air supremacy was quickly achieved. This did much to ensure the success of the ground offensives. The one failure that the Luftwaffe had during this first period of the war was against Britain's RAF in 1940 during the Battle of Britain. There were a number of reasons for this. The RAF had two fighters which could match those of the Luftwaffe. The workmanlike Hurricane was more maneuverable than the Me-110. The Supermarine Spitfire lacked the firepower of the Me-109, having just .303-inch machine guns as opposed to the latter's heavy machine guns and 20mm cannon, which meant that it was outranged. On the other hand, its top speed was equivalent to the Me-109. and the Spitfire's controls were less sluggish at high altitude. The cockpit was also less cramped. Thus, the two were evenly matched in performance. But the Me-109 had a serious drawback in that it only carried sufficient fuel for just over an hour's flying. This drastically limited its combat time over the English coast. The British radar stations also gave timely warning. This, together with a very efficient command and control system, often enabled the RAF fighters to gain altitude over their opponents, as important in air combat as it had been in 1918. Indeed, the Luftwaffe paid dearly for failing to maintain its attacks on the radar system. RAF Fighter Command won the crucial Battle of Britain, but was not so successful the following year, 1941. It took the battle to the Luftwaffe with cross-channel sweeps in order to draw the German fighters up into the air. Now the Germans, operating close to their bases in northern France, had more fuel available for combat than their opponents. Hitler's invasion of Russia in June 1941 did, however, weaken the German fighter strength in the West. But during the second half of 1941, the Germans introduced the formidable Focke-Wulf FW-190. Able to attain a speed of well over 400 miles per hour, it could at low altitude outmaneuver the Spitfire 5 then in service. Yet the Me-109 remained the main German fighter, because the performance of the 190 fell off above 20,000 feet. The 109 Gustav, which appeared in early 1942, performed well at the higher altitudes and soon became the backbone of the fighter arm. This was especially after the US 8th Air Force began its daylight bombing offensive against occupied Europe in earnest at the end of that year. The main American fighter was the P-47 Thunderbolt, which, like the Spitfire and the Me-109, underwent several improvements during the war. This again was able to achieve speeds of well over 400 miles per hour, but for much of the war over northwest Europe, it was tied to the American bombers as their escort, and suffered from lack of range when it came to accompanying them deep into Germany. The advent of the P-51B Mustang, with extra fuel tanks in 1944, overcame this problem. At the same time, in order to establish and maintain air supremacy over France and the Low Countries in preparation for the Normandy landings, the American fighters were unleashed from the bombers. Simultaneously, the RAF introduced the Hawker Tempest, which, like later versions of the Thunderbolt, could fly at over 450 miles per hour. On the Eastern Front, the Germans enjoyed air supremacy up until 1943. Obsolete Soviet types, like these Polikarpov I-15s and I-16s, were no match for the German fighters. But the Russians enjoyed a strong aeronautical design tradition, and by mid-1943 they had introduced aircraft like this MiG-3, capable of matching the Luftwaffe. They were helped by the supply of almost 20,000 British and American aircraft under Lend-Lease, and some Western Allied fighter squadrons even fought on the Eastern Front for a time. Thus, the Germans found themselves also facing British Hurricanes, as well as American P-39 Airacobras and P-40 Warhawks. In the early months of the war in North Africa, obsolete Italian CR-42s took off to duel with just as elderly British Gloucester Gladiators. three Gladiators, nicknamed Faith, Hope and Charity, provided the mainstay of the British air defence during the early months of the Siege of Malta. In the Pacific War, the Japanese Mitsubishi Zero fighter dominated during the first part of the conflict. Contrary to preconceived Western beliefs, the Japanese pilots proved to be just as skillful as their adversaries. But 1944 saw the advent of the jet fighter, with the British Meteor combating German V-1 flying bombs. The very first jet aircraft, the German prototype Heinkel HE-178, actually flew as early as August 1939. RAF officer Frank Whittle had been working in Britain on jet engines for many years before his Gloucester Whittle first flew in May 1941. The Messerschmitt Me-262, Germany's first operational jet, was delayed into service because for a long time Hitler wanted it to be a bomber rather than a fighter. The Germans also introduced the Arado 234, the so-called Blitz bomber. But faster than all the jets was the Me-163 Comet rocket plane, which could reach a speed of almost 600 miles per hour. But it only had fuel for 90 seconds of flight, after which it operated as a high-speed glider. The Americans too developed a jet fighter, the Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star. But although two were sent to Italy in spring 1945, it entered service too late to see action. During 1939-45, aircraft were used for spotting targets and controlling artillery fire, as they had been in the Great War. But more efficient radio communications made them much more effective during the Second World War. Likewise, fighter ground attack was developed into a fine art. The Germans initially led the way with the Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber, which proved a devastating weapon during the early Blitzkrieg campaigns. This worked closely with the panzer formations as aerial artillery, and its siren often served to terrify ground troops. The British armed a Hurricane with bombs, calling it a hurry bomber, during the desert campaigns in North Africa. Both the British and the Germans also used their ground attack aircraft as tank busters, equipping them with cannon-firing armor-piercing ammunition. Rocket-firing aircraft, like the Hawker Typhoon, were also used extensively during the latter half of the war, especially during the 1944-45 campaign in northwest Europe. The Russians too developed an effective close air support aircraft in the Ilyushin IL-2 Stormovik. This first appeared in summer 1941, but was extensively modified as a result of its early combat experience. By 1944, the art of close air support had been developed to a high degree, with radio-equipped Air Force teams operating with the forward troops. The Allies had such air power that they were able to operate a cab rank system, with fighter bombers queuing up to be directed onto targets. In Normandy too, Allied heavy bombers were used in direct support of the ground troops. They were employed to soften up the German defenses before an attack, carrying out carpet bombing. Sometimes, though, inaccurate bombing meant that friendly troops suffered. Also, the damage the bombers did on the ground often slowed the advance. But air power was also directly involved in the land war in other ways, especially by virtue of the transport aircraft. The Germans and the Russians had begun to develop airborne forces in the 1930s. It was the Germans who first used them in action during their invasion of Norway in April 1940. But the most spectacular of the German airborne operations was the invasion of the island of Crete in May 1941, with some 5,000 men being dropped. The loss of Juncker's Ju-52 transports, however, deterred the Germans from mounting any more such operations on a large scale. The British and Americans also began to use airborne forces to spearhead their invasions, from northwest Africa in November 1942 onwards. In spring 1944, the Allies formed the First Allied Airborne Army, whose divisions played a major part in the Normandy landings. They also very nearly struck the Germans a decisive blow in Holland in September 1944. The operation only failed because the ground forces were unable to link up with the British and Polish paratroops at Arnhem in time. But not only paratroops were employed in airborne operations. Both the Germans and the Allies used glider-borne troops. Then, once an airfield had been secured, reinforcements could be flown in by air, as the Germans did on Crete. Indeed, it was the Germans who had the largest transport aircraft of the war, the Me-323 Gigant, which also had a glider version. The Chindits in Burma in 1944 even created makeshift airstrips deep inside Japanese-occupied territory in order to fly in troops and supplies. Burma and the Pacific also saw extensive use made of resupply by parachute. There was too the airlift of material from India to China. In the early 1920s, American General Billy Mitchell carried out a series of experiments to demonstrate how effective aircraft could be against ships. The Second World War was to prove Mitchell right. It was the aircraft carrier which transformed the war at sea, taking over from the battleship as a Navy's principal weapons platform. But land-based aircraft were just as effective. The Royal Navy in the Mediterranean suffered especially from aircraft operating from southern Italy and Sicily in its attempts to keep Malta supplied. The British also lost numerous warships from German air attack during the evacuations of the army from France in 1940 and Crete in 1941. There was too the loss of the capital ships Prince of Wales and Repulse to Japanese air attack off the Malayan coast in December 1941. It was British heavy bombers which finally sank the German battleship Tirpitz, so long the major threat to the supply convoys to Russia. The bomb they used was the 12,000-pound Tallboy. This had the fuse in the tail, which enabled it to penetrate the ship's armor before detonating. Yet the Arctic convoys also suffered from attack by German aircraft based in Norway, which, like Sicily in the Mediterranean, was likened to a land aircraft carrier. But warships themselves adopted ever stronger anti-aircraft armament, and aircraft losses were high. By the end of 1941, the RAF's anti-shipping squadrons, mainly equipped with the Beaufort, was suffering a significantly higher casualty rate than any other branch of the service. The Germans developed a very effective anti-ship weapon in the HS-293 glider bomb, which caused the Allies several shipping losses in the Mediterranean from 1943. Another anti-shipping weapon was designed by the British in order to attack the Tirpitz. Highball worked on the same principle as the bouncing bomb used in the RAF's famous Dams raid of 1943, but was never used in anger. In World War II's longest-running campaign, the Battle of the Atlantic, the aircraft played an ever-increasing role. During the first half of the battle, long-range German Focke-Wulf Condors operating from western France ranged far and wide over the Atlantic. They directed U-boats onto convoys and themselves attacked ships with success. Likewise, Allied aircraft, as they had done, together with airships during the Great War, could spot U-boats on the surface and direct warships onto them. The surfaced U-boat was also very vulnerable to air attack, and this accounted for half of the German submarines sunk during the war. The RAF also developed the Lee Light, a searchlight system fitted under the fuselage for attacking surfaced U-boats at night. The major turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic came in May 1943, when the Germans were forced to temporarily withdraw their U-boats. This was thanks to more effective naval weapons and anti-submarine tactics, and also to aircraft. The very long-range American B-24 Liberator maritime patrol aircraft played a crucial role in finally closing the so-called Black Gap, that part of the North Atlantic which until then could not be covered by land-based aircraft. Delays in deploying sufficient maritime patrol B-24s were because this aircraft had another role which was viewed as more important, namely as a strategic bomber. During the Great War of 1914-18, German Zeppelins and later bombers had attacked England. Likewise, British and French bombers had struck targets in Western Germany. This had led to the belief that bombing could destroy a country's will to continue to wage war. But implicit in this were attacks against civilians, which were seen as contrary to the laws of war. In the 1930s, the bombing of Madrid and Guernica during the Spanish Civil War served to convince people that the bomber would dominate future major wars. This was reinforced by Japanese air attacks on Chinese cities like Shanghai and Nanking in 1937. The greatest fear was that air forces would employ gas bombs. Hence, as the clouds of war in Europe loomed over the horizon once more, nations began to equip their civilians with gas masks. Yet at the outbreak of war in 1939, the combatant nations laid down strict guidelines for their bomber forces. They were to attack only military targets and avoid collateral civilian damage. But within 3 weeks of the German invasion of Poland, the Luftwaffe was bombing Warsaw. The German justification was that the Polish capital had made itself a military target by refusing to surrender. The German attack on Rotterdam in May 1940 was for the same reason, but could have been avoided if the message to the German bombers to turn back had got through to them in time. During the Battle of Britain, the main targets for the German bombers were airfields, radar stations, docks and aircraft factories. The Blitz on Britain only began as a result of a navigational error by a German bomber, which dropped its bombs on London by mistake. The RAF immediately retaliated with a raid on Berlin, and the era of city busting had begun. Even so, at this stage, the bombers of both sides were still instructed to attack specific targets, usually munitions factories, but they had severe problems in achieving accuracy. At the beginning of the war, both the Luftwaffe and RAF intended to bomb by day, since it was easier to find the target. But by the beginning of 1940, the British bombers had suffered severely at the hands of the German fighters and changed to bombing by night. The Germans followed suit in September 1940 for the same reason. Navigation, which was reliant on dead reckoning, suffered, however. Bomb sights, too, were little different to those of 1918 and were just as inaccurate. In the summer of 1941, the British commissioned a study into bombing accuracy and established that only some 10% of bombers were getting their bombs to within 5 miles of targets in Western Germany. Clearly, something had to be done to improve navigation. But even so, as munitions factories were usually close to or in urban areas, it was inevitable that civilians would suffer. In the autumn of 1940, the Germans had developed a system of radio beams intersecting over the target in order to improve accuracy. But the RAF developed countermeasures to bend the beams. In spring 1942, the RAF introduced a similar system called G, which was incorporated in a new breed of heavy bombers. At the beginning of the war, both the Luftwaffe and the RAF had only medium bombers, like the Heinkel HE-111 and Vickers Wellington. These had limited range and payload. The Germans had envisaged war merely against neighboring nations, and hence saw no real need for long-range heavy bombers, besides which many more lighter bombers could be built. True, they did reconsider this decision later, during the war, but heavy bombers like this Heinkel HE-177 never really got beyond the prototype stage. Such were the conflicting priority demands for new aircraft types. The RAF too initially concentrated on medium bombers in an attempt to match the Luftwaffe numerically. But in the late 1930s, specifications were drawn up for heavy bombers. These began to come into service during the first half of 1941. Then, in spring 1942, came the Avro Lancaster, destined to become one of the outstanding bombers of the war. Throughout this time, Winston Churchill had seen RAF Bomber Command as the only direct way of hitting back at Germany and reducing the pressure on the Russians. Provided it had enough heavy bombers, the RAF could destroy the German economy and the morale of her people by attacking her cities. The problem was that bombers were not Britain's only aircraft need. In particular, more maritime patrol aircraft were desperately required to keep the U-boats at bay in the Atlantic. Thus, bomber production could not be given absolute priority. In February 1942, RAF Bomber Command received a new chief, blunt-speaking Arthur Harris, soon to be nicknamed Bomber. He believed, and the air staff supported him in this, that the policy of city-busting or area bombing could bring Germany to her knees and achieve ultimate victory without large ground force casualties being suffered.
They sowed the wind, and now they are going to reap the whirlwind. Cologne, Lubeck, Rostock, those are only just the beginning.
In order to demonstrate what could be done if he had sufficient bombers, Harris launched 3 1,000 bomber raids at the end of May 1942. But this meant borrowing aircraft from elsewhere. The RAF could not maintain this size of raid and would be unable to do so until mid-1944. But the British bombers had to contend with an ever more effective German air defense. A combination of radars, searchlights, anti-aircraft guns and night fighters were organized in zones covering the approaches to Germany and the major cities. These defenses ensured that RAF Bomber Command would pay dearly for its attacks. Harris was by now looking to the Americans, whose 8th Air Force was now building up in Britain, to lend weight to the campaign. Its main strength lay in the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. While it did not carry the bomb load of the RAF's Lancaster, it had considerably more defensive weapons. The Americans believed that they could attack Germany by day and use the B-17's armament to keep the fighters at bay. The 8th Air Force B-17s made their operational debut in mid-August 1942. But it was to be some months before they were in sufficient strength to launch major attacks against Germany. In the meantime, they contented themselves with gaining operational experience over France and the Low Countries. Early results were impressive, especially in terms of bombing accuracy. This was thanks to the Norden bomb site, with which the US aircraft were equipped. In January 1943, the Allies agreed on a combined bombing offensive as a necessary step to final victory over Germany. Under the codename Point Blank, the RAF would continue to attack by night while the Americans did so by day. This was termed round-the-clock bombing. Point Blank was launched in earnest by the RAF in March 1943. This was the beginning of what was called the Battle of the Ruhr, the main industrial region in western Germany, and which lay up against the east bank of the River Rhine. The battle would last for 4 months, but the result was inconclusive. Industrial haze and effective German air defenses were the main reason. But the RAF also underestimated the ability of the Germans to recover from these attacks. Indeed, the RAF ignored the fact that the British people had remained resilient under the Blitz of 1940-41 and believed that the much more disciplined Germans would crack under the same pressure. Yet not all of the RAF attacks were of the city-busting variety. Light and medium bombers did make attacks by day. Many of these were made at low level in order to gain surprise. The versatile twin-engine de Havilland Mosquito, with its all-wooden airframe, was especially effective at low level, as the attack on the Gestapo's jail at Amiens in northern France shows. British aircraft designer Barnes Wallis was responsible for the RAF's most spectacular raid of the war, which was against German dams and took place in May 1943. The dams could not be attacked by conventional bombs, and so Wallis designed a special type, which bounced on the water and struck horizontally rather than vertically. A special Lancaster squadron was formed and mounted the operation on the night of the 16th-17th of May. Two of the 3 dams attacked were breached, but 8 out of the 19 aircraft involved failed to return. Even so, the attack provided a major boost to RAF Bomber Command's morale. Towards the end of July 1943, Harris targeted the North German city port of Hamburg, which he was determined to destroy. In the course of 4 attacks in 10 days, he almost did so, creating the most horrific firestorms, with the Americans attacking by day to compound the damage. But August 1943 was a bad month for the American bombers. On the 1st of the month, the 9th Air Force, based in North Africa, launched a daring low-level attack against the Ploiești oil fields in Romania. The low altitude of the bombers meant that the German radars were unable to spot them on their way to the target. This meant that the German air defenses had little or no warning of the bombers' approach. The bombers reached the oil fields and caused considerable damage. The return flight, however, was a different story, with 1/3 of the 177 B-24s being lost. Many other bombers were severely damaged. Two weeks later, the 8th Air Force struck at the Me-109 fighter factory at Regensburg and the ball bearing factory at Schweinfurt. Again, losses were high, with 60 of the 376 bombers involved being shot down and a further 170 damaged. No Air Force could sustain losses like these. Consequently, the 8th Air Force was forced to withdraw to the fringes in order to lick its wounds. But in October 1943, the Americans attacked Schweinfurt again, with another 60 B-17s failing to return. The Americans almost lost confidence in daylight attacks and seriously considered switching to night operations. In truth, the main problem was that their bombers, although heavily armed, could not defend themselves. Yet they did have dedicated escort fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning, but neither of these types had the range to escort the bombers to targets deep in Germany. The solution lay in the P-51B Mustang, which began to appear in early 1944. In autumn 1943, RAF Bomber Command opened the third of its major offensives under point blank, that against Berlin. It was to be the grimmest battle yet in view of the defenses round the German capital. Several attacks were made on Berlin during the winter of 1943-44, but hopes that the RAF could achieve another Hamburg were in vain. Worse, bomber losses rose alarmingly as the battle wore on. Berlin, although battered, was not destroyed, and it was a battle lost for RAF Bomber Command. The newly formed US 15th Air Force in the Mediterranean had also begun to attack targets in Germany. But the strategic bombing forces in Britain were now passed to Eisenhower's command in order to prepare for the cross-channel invasion. While the bomber barons, American Carl Spaatz and Arthur Harris, believed it was a mistake to switch their attacks from Germany, the contribution they made to the success of Overlord, the invasion of France, was immense. This was both in destroying transportation targets and in drastically reducing the Luftwaffe's strength in northern France. In September 1944, the bombers returned to Germany in force. Oil was now the top priority, although city busting continued. The Luftwaffe continued to attack bombers in the air, but with large numbers of Mustangs about, success was very much harder to achieve. Meanwhile, Germany's infrastructure was being steadily destroyed. But it was the attack on Dresden in February 1945 which brought the morality of area bombing to the fore. The city had virtually no targets of military significance, yet much of it was destroyed and some 50,000 lives lost. Even so, the bombers continued to blitz Germany until the very end of the war. During this period, ever larger types of bombs were used, ranging from this 8,000-pound type to the massive 22,000-pound Grand Slam, which the RAF used to good effect against viaducts and other difficult targets. The long strategic bombing offensive against Germany was not decisive on its own. Indeed, not only did it fail to break the morale of the German people, but it could not prevent German war production from peaking during late 1943. The cost in bombers and the lives of aircrew was very high. RAF Bomber Command's losses were such that of every 100 aircrew who embarked on a tour of operations, 60 would be killed before they had completed the statutory 30 missions. It was much the same for the Americans. Yet, while not decisive, the offensive did make a significant contribution to the defeat of Hitler's Germany. This compensated for the high losses in men and aircraft. In the war in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, the Japanese used their bombers to spearhead their Oriental Blitzkrieg. The Japanese did not see bombing as decisive in its own right, but air attacks on the Philippines, Singapore, and elsewhere undoubtedly had an effect on the morale of the defenders. The Allies, on the other hand, were out of range of mainland Japan for much of the war. Indeed, before June 1944, only one air attack was made on Japan. This was the audacious strike by B-25 bombers from the carrier Hornet in April 1942. But it was little more than a morale raiser for the embattled Americans. It was not until the massive Boeing B-29, capable of carrying a 20,000-pound bomb load over 3,000 miles, came into service in 1944, that land-based American bombers could reach Japan. The B-29 was deployed to India and to bases in southern China, and made its first attack on Japan from the latter on the 15th of June 1944. But the Japanese then launched an offensive into southern China, and the B-29 bases there had to be evacuated. However, the capture of Saipan and Tinian in the Mariana Islands in the Central Pacific in midsummer 1944 gave the B-29s alternative bases within range of Japan. Towards the end of November, they began to carry out high-altitude attacks once more. But the results in terms of bombing accuracy were disappointing. Furthermore, Japanese fighters, albeit at great cost to themselves, were shooting down and damaging an increasing number of B-29s. This forced the B-29s to switch to night bombing. They were to attack at low level in order to improve accuracy. Recognizing that many Japanese houses were built of wood, incendiaries made up most of the bomb load. The first of these attacks was made against the Japanese capital Tokyo on the night of the 9th-10th of March 1945. The results were devastating, with 2 square miles of the city being totally destroyed. Attacks on other Japanese cities followed. The capture of Iwo Jima at the end of March 1945 brought Japan to within P-51 Mustang range and meant that the B-29s could resume daylight raids and that B-17s could join them. Throughout the summer of 1945, the bombers pounded Japan, destroying much of her remaining industry. But while the Japanese began to make vague overtures for peace, there was no evidence that they would accept unconditional surrender, and a large segment of the population was determined to fight on to the bitter end. This was even though Japan's cities were being obliterated. Hence the Allied decision to use the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This did bring about surrender, and it could be argued that the pre-war air theorists had finally been vindicated. But it was the weapon used, rather than the means of delivery, which had proved decisive. It was a weapon whose future potential was to prove awesome.